Podcasters, how is everyone doing this morning? I thought we'd talk about crunchy corns, unicorns. No, crunch time. Crunchy times. Talk about crunchy times. Morning, Hemtine. Morning. So, game dev crunch. That's an interesting topic. It's a fun times, happy times topic. Crunch times. So I have a lot of stories about crunchy times. For those of you who are not aware, sorry, my eyes are just passing over, and I should have looked for it before I started stream. Do you know, I don't think I have a display copy out. I need to get one of my display copies out, so at least I have it in hand and I can bring it up here. I actually did a book. It wasn't just about crunch. It was about the games industry generally. But I did a comic book that was a collection of stories, all anonymous, but they were all first-hand stories. So they were all stories from myself or my friends or people I trusted, so there was no second-hand bullshit, there was no gossip, all that. They were 100% true. But I anonymized them and washed them and threw them in the mixer and made a comic about them. That was a really fun experience, and I really would love to do another one of those. And I'm actually currently started 2020, I was working on one about growing up in Africa and some stories between me and my friends. But that project is a bit on hold, and 2020 has not been kind to that project. But yeah, the game dev stories one, it sold relatively well. Obviously we haven't been at comic conventions and pushing it and stuff, but people seem to really enjoy it, and people have found humor and solace in it. So it's fun to share these stories. It is fun to share stories, both amusing and terrible, about the games industry. Shared tragedy is comedy. Is what it comes down to. But it's also, I think, knowledge. Knowledge is useful. Knowing that this is not normal. Knowing that this is normal. Knowing that, what the fuck, this is fucked up. We should all do something about this. It's useful. Now, the games industry's shifted and changed, and the norms are different between countries. The norms are different between studios. So there's no singular experience, but let us just say we all talk to each other and the commonalities are there, and it's no big surprise that I'm talking about this a few days before Cyberpunk's released. And Cyberpunk's been notorious for how bad the crunch has been on that. So yeah, let's talk about crunch, baby. So I think the first thing with crunch to realize is it happens outside the games industry, but in creative jobs, it tends to happen a lot more. And that's because there really are, two broad categories of crunch, and that comes into implied crunch and explicit crunch. So that's explicit crunch are what I think most people think crunch is. And explicit crunch is, in most cases, pretty illegal, at least in Europe. And it's pretty rare. And I think most people recognize explicit crunch as bullshit. But it does happen. It does happen. Cyberpunk is an example of explicit crunch. I still remember one of the first companies that I knew of doing explicit crunch was my first year in the industry, and a bunch of my friends were working at a company nearby, and I was working at another company. And that company was so bad. This is the other thing, is the companies that do explicit crunch tend to be pretty shit anyway. This was a company where the boss bought himself a fast supercar, and within a month or two, the entire staff had a pay delay. So they didn't get paid on time. They got paid a month late. And if you've ever lived paycheck to paycheck, you know just how devastating that can be to have a pay delay. You know, it causes a huge amount of hardship. And you know, it's really funny because they were like, well, you know, if you're having trouble with your mortgage or with your rent or whatever, come to us and we'll help you through the pay delay. And they would never give you the money. They would only send the money directly to the person that, you know, you have to pay. And this was them being kind and generous. And you're like, no, fucking bitches, pay me my money on time. Yeah, no, there's been some bad stories around that. There's been some really bad stories around that. But yeah, this company in particular, like the boss would stand at the door at leaving time and take note of who left on time. And I know other companies where they set up webcams in the parking lot, and they would like track when the cars, because they didn't have a punch in punch out times code system, but they would track when the cars came in or the cars came out, or you know, other stories of using like time tracking software on the PC, or I've heard so many versions of the story in so many different studios where basically they didn't say you had to work long hours, but they tracked the hours you did work. And whenever it came down to pay review, when it came down to who to fire or whatever, they just let go of the people who weren't working crazy long hours. And now some people might say that that's implied crunch, but it's not. It's explicit crunch. That is the boss like leaning on hard. And you know, and sometimes it gets even worse than that. Like in the Cyberpunk example, in a few other large studios examples, there are cases where producers have been like, okay, they literally say, we are in crunch, we need you to come in, we need you to work late, we need you to come in on the weekend, or you know, and sometimes that is for prolonged periods. And sometimes it's because like they're like, well, we've got this deadline next week that we need to hit, so everyone needs to come in this weekend. And that everyone needs to come in this weekend, or everyone, you know, needs to come in if we need you mentality, I have seen it even very positive studios. Studios with good reputations have done that in short bursts. So it's tricky. You can't say you should never do that, because sometimes, you know, companies do need that, right? It's a competitive industry. It's the problem is when it becomes a habit or an expectation, or when our employees aren't compensated for it. But you know, there are situations where the industry isn't about like stamping out widgets, right? It's about creative problem solving, and sometimes the problem that you thought would get solved in a week takes a month. You know, so it gets tough. So that's a tricky one. That is basically the boss saying, come in. That explicit crunch. And I think that's what most people think about when they think about crunch. But I would also say that is A, unfashionable, and B, much easier to tackle. Much easier to tackle. It still happens though. It still happens. It's still very, very shitty. And when you ask, well, like, why aren't more people talking up about it? Well, as I say, it's not always bad. Sometimes it's a very, very short burst, and it's understandable. It's happened on Dreams, for example. That weekend things happen on Dreams, where we've had a deadline or a build that has to go out, and they're like, well, can the people who are going to help us do that, like QA or whatever, come in and smoke the build on the weekend or whatever. But the difference between when it happens at a good studio is A, it's extremely rare, and B, everyone's compensated. Everyone is given a healthy bonus, everyone's taken care of, you know, these things happen. But, it is shitty. And they would also, like, accept excuses like, oh, I need to go to a wedding, or I need, I have these plans or whatever. Like, they're more understanding the human factor. But it does happen, across the best studios to the worst studios. The difference is that the best studios treat it with the nuance and the stuff that it deserves. So yeah, that's a tough one. It is a tough one. But it can get bad. And the thing that I've also seen with those kind of crunch situations is a studio that was doing it healthily or was doing it okay-ish can get hard times, especially if it's a smaller studio that doesn't have the backing of a big corporate or the backing of someone with deep pockets. It can be a situation where, we've had a rough, project or two, or maybe a project's fallen through, or contract's fallen through, or something bad's happened. This happens to businesses, and it's feeling the squeeze, and so it's like, let's rally together, blitz spirit. And that's toxic as fuck. On the one hand, you're like, yes, I love this job and I want to save this job. But at the end of the day, it's a fucking job. You don't have equity in the company. Now, it's a little bit different if it's an indie studio and you do literally have equity in the company. Like, if it is a small indie studio with like 4 or 5 of you, and, if the game does well, you're all going to do well kind of thing. That's different. Still not necessarily healthy, but it's different. Equity matters. And, yeah, that's tough. But the games industry, we've generally disposed of royalty structures, mostly because people don't like the licensing bullshit that comes with it. And it's not bullshit, it's actually really valid. But, they didn't want us to go the route of Hollywood or the route of music, where the talent has, revenue share. The talent has revenue share. Because that's too complicated for businesses. Used to be a lot more acceptable, and a lot of indies and other people still do rev share models, but generally studios don't. So that's the explicit kind. That's the easy to talk about kind, because it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it's a duck. We all know it's crunch. The much, much more insidious form, and the form that is knowingly abused, is implicit crunch. So this is the fact that, well, A, it's a creative job, so it's very hard to know how good you're doing at the job, right? So, if you work a job that has measurable goals, like, I've worked in retail, and you can look at your sales commission and you can go, oh, everyone, like, here's a leaderboard in the store or whatever. You're doing well. You sold a lot of junk. That's obvious. I've worked in a bank, and I've worked in a call center, and, I've worked both in product development in a bank, and I've worked in, like, boring, like, desk work where you'd, like, tick off KPIs kind of stuff. And the KPI stuff, at least, and like the jobs where you can just sort of tally sheet your day. It's very obvious when you do a lot of work or when you do not very much work, and the work's not very variable. Those tend to be lower end jobs and jobs that don't pay as well, but when you did a good day or a bad day. In video games, it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult, because sometimes you get given a hard job. Sometimes, it's like, if you're doing art, did I do a good art? Did I do a bad art? Who knows? So, yeah, it's hard to measure the work you're doing. But then probably the most toxic part of it is you give a shit. You give a shit about your job. You really, really care about your job. And so you're like, I want to work a little bit harder to, like, make this a better game. Or, let's talk about that one first. I want to work a bit harder to make this a better game. Or, I don't know if I'm doing enough work or I'm doing a good enough job, right? And so this often can be a case where your production team's not very good, and they're just giving you too much work to do. And the thing is, they've given you too much work to do, but you're like maybe junior, maybe you're uncomfortable, maybe you're going through stuff or whatever, and you don't say, this is too much work. Or you don't say, or you feel like, oh wow, everyone else is getting their work done, I'm not getting their work done. But you're getting more stuff piled on you, and so you just come in longer, you work harder, and the thing is so there's two kinds of things. Sometimes it's knowingly abused, and I have seen companies where they knowingly abuse it, and these companies tend to have a high churn rate, they tend to hire a lot of graduates, they tend to, they tend to exploit people with the imposter syndrome. And I've seen companies that churn through staff at the junior level. They might have like a senior core, like this group of people that have been with the company for years, but the bulk of the work staff is churning. So I've seen it knowingly abused. But then it can also be, even in a relatively good company, just not enough oversight, right? And a good sign of a company is, sometimes this will happen, even in the best of companies, if your senior staff become aware of it. In the good companies, the thing to do, and the responsible thing to do as a senior, is to say go home. Is to say, you've done enough, just go home. Take your holiday. Your holiday's accumulated, take a break. Because, we know long term that's the best thing to do, both for the person and for the company. But it's tough. It's tough because it's in video games, people have a lot of their personal identity tied up in crunch. And I've done stupid stuff over the years. And it's hard sometimes to know whether or not you were knowingly exploited or you were just an idiot. I still remember the first game I ever shipped. The hours I put into that. So, well, it wasn't actually the first game I shipped, but it was the first game that I was on from start to the end as the lead programmer. And it was a troubled project. It was a very troubled project. We got the project after another studio failed to complete the project, and we had to respec it and rework it, and we had to figure out what it was. And not only that, but I managed to pitch for more money for the project, but the more money came with more features. And the hours I put into that one, I slept on the office sofa more times than I can count. I think there was one point I was only going home for showers and like fresh changes of clothes, and I would do that at like lunch, or I'd do that in the morning, or when there was a gap where like the computers were doing work and I couldn't do anything, and that was bad. That was really bad. That was, I think, only the second worst crunch I've ever been through. But as I say, I don't know how much of that was company and how much of that was my own stupid idiocy, because it was a lot of pride. It was my first lead role. The project had a lot of trouble, and I was trying to fix it all, and it was a thing. It was rough. But to answer your question about, are there any specific genres of crunch? No. There's types of country. There's types of companies. So, for example, that game, that Cleverman Experiment game, was a digital-only, family-friendly quiz-style game. The last game you'd associate with crunch. The more creative a project, the more likely crunch is to happen. Teams working on things like the latest FIFA or the latest franchise or iteration title tend not to crunch as much, not because the companies are better or worse, because the work is more predictable. Now, someone could hit a shitty rock and end up crunching a bunch. But generally speaking, the projects are more predictable. The less predictable the project, the more likely there is to be crunch. But yeah, that was rough. That was super rough, that one. And as I say, on that case, I don't know whether that was imposed or a thing. Sorry, I'm navigating the conversation and the stories carefully because there's lawsuits and there's legal consequences. And, some of the stuff has got pretty messy over the years. I know where too many bodies are buried. We've had unionization fights against some employers, and I've seen I've seen some pretty nasty stuff, and a lot of agreements signed for people to sort of look the other way. It's like one of the classic ones is, in Europe at least, we brought out the European Working Hours Directive. This was like, in 2004, 2002? So anyway, the EU Working Hours Directive came out, and pretty much every games industry company, to this day, when you sign your contract, you waive your rights. Like, it's explicitly, there's a separate piece of paper you sign to say, I do not want to be protected by the European Working Hours Directive. And freaking, if that's your first job in the games industry, even if it's your second job in the games industry, people don't know what signing that piece of paper means. And I mean, it's reasonable to sign that piece of paper a lot of times because, as I say, there are companies that'll ask you to maybe in an entire year work one weekend, and you'll be compensated for it. You'll be taken care. Like, it's not automatically bad. Things happen. But yeah, it's very hard without scope and realization to identify that you this is why you need to talk to other people. This is why you need to share stories. This is why experience helps, because you need to spot that crunch time and whether or not it's healthy or not. And as I said, the bulk of it is this implicit time. EA Spouse. Yeah, no, I remember EA Spouse. I remember watching it unfold as I was in the industry. A new team, a new IP for a team, a new genre for a team, new technology. Yeah, high risk factors. Anything, like, as I say, the bulk, excluding shitty companies where they're like graduate churn farms or whatever, the bulk of crunch is because someone said, or multiple people said and thought, the task would take this long, and it ended up taking this long. And as I say, if you've got good enough production, they pad for it, they work it out. But even in the best of studios, there will come a time where you're up against it, and a little bit of extra squeeze, a little bit of extra crunch will solve it. And there's times where it doesn't. And it's much easier if you're backed by a big corporate to, like if you work at like one of the Sony studios. There's been multiple times where a Sony studio has hit this problem. And sometimes it's not even like the build breaks. Sometimes it's like the game's just not as fun as it should be. Or our early mock reviews are coming back with scores of low 70s when we want, high 80s, 90s. And the game gets delayed by a year or more. But sometimes it's almost better when everything's on fire. Because when everything's on fire, you're like, well, let's just delay the game. Or let's just push everything back. The worst, though, is when there's that one issue that will stop you from shipping. Or maybe it's like 2 or 3 issues that'll stop you from shipping. But you're like, well, if we can conquer this mountain. Oh. And it happens. It happens. But yeah, as I say, as I was saying, Implicit Crunch is, I think, the one that is harder to recognize and is tougher. And it all comes down to the fact that people are emotionally tied in to the result of the product. Because when it's just a job, when it is a 9 to 5 and you can see this as this person is giving me money for a thing, and I'm doing the thing. But let's be honest, if you were that kind of person, the bulk of people in the games industry could leave the games industry, earn better money, be better treated. But they wouldn't have the passion, they wouldn't have the creative work and stuff. So most people are emotionally involved in the outcome of the labor. And that is also, like, scientifically, we know you will be a happier person if you feel like you have purpose and you're doing the stuff that you care about. So it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing to work on a job you're passionate about. But it can lead you to do some stupid things. So, as I said before, if you're working long hours and you have good seniors and you have good teams around you, they will turn around and go home, you're working too much. But something that's happened to a lot of people, and it happens to myself a lot, is, as I say, you want to make this thing a little bit better, you want to put a little bit of polish on it, so you work a bit longer. And then the other thing that happens, and this has happened to me a lot in the last, this has been the most common kind of crunch for me in the last 7 years. The last 7 years so basically since I joined Sony and I felt pretty comfortable and I've got a good job and all this stuff, the kind of crunch I've experienced personally in the last 7 years, and the kind of crunch that's most common for me to see among my peers, is what I call proof crunch or prototype crunch. So this is where there is no time in the schedule to experiment or play, or there's just, there's a certain amount of time in a creative job where you need to be in a closed mindset and an open mindset. And those ratios vary at different times of production and different things and the type of role you're in and But in an open mindset, it's got to be, you can't be thinking about the next deadline, and you've literally just got to be like, open my mind to the possibilities and explore. And if at the end of that, if you're in a good, healthy company, and this is the problem where I've seen small companies try this and it fails horribly. But if you're in a good, open company and you do this open mindset work, and at the end, you turn around and you go, we learned a lot of things. We deleted all the code. We learned a lot of things not to do, but we learned a lot of things. But at the end of the day, there's been no immediate value added to the product. A good company will turn around and say, well done, very good. Like that you wrote up the report, like that there's all these learnings. That was what that was for. A bad company will be like, ooh, why did we do this again? Oh, can we use any of that? And they'll push to use that. So as I say, that's the prototype time, that open time, that R&D time. It's not the despair. I can take the despair. It's the hope I can't stand. Oh, that hurts. Yeah. So this is it. What happens is, like, there's this feature that gets cut out of scope, or there's this idea that maybe not everyone agrees with you about, or you think would be amazing, but maybe you can't communicate it to the team. Maybe you can't get people on board or whatever. And so then what will happen sometimes is a small group of devs, or maybe a single dev, will go away and they will try to prove this on the weekend or the evenings. And some of the best features that have ever happened have come out of that. It is a very natural, creative thing to go, fuck you all, I'm going to go prove it. That is some of the best creative work has come out of that personal fire to go and build the thing and prove it can be done better. But the problem is that it can become a habit, or it can become a bit of a martyrdom. And yeah, depending on your personality, and it tends to happen to program. That particular thing tends to happen to programmers more. I've seen it happen to level designers a lot. Ironically, level designers get that one a bunch, like where they're like, this could be better. And I mean, there's actually a relatively famous story about Mark doing this on the first LBP, where he went off and he was like, fuck you all, and he redid some of the early levels. I think it was the garden, and it works out, you know. But yeah, that type of crunch is dangerous. That type of crunch, because, as I say, some of the greatest game development breakthroughs have come through it, and no one's telling you to do it. In fact, often people are actively telling you not to do it, and you're rebelling or you're pushing for this thing, and it's purely from emotional investment. So yeah, this is why I say explicit crunch, where it quacks like a duck, it walks like a duck. It's easier to fight. It still happens, and it happens more often than you would think, but it happens a lot less now. And as I say, for the cyberpunk examples, come back to that. The reason you're not hearing as many devs complain about that is, well, A, you get into a wartime mentality, you get into a we're all in this together kind of mentality. So that's the first sort of layer of it. The second layer of it is contractual. You often are, and this is when the red flags and the warning lights should be going off. You can't talk about it, because a good company will let you talk about these things and not punish you severely. When people are like, don't talk about a thing, that's a huge flashing red light. And then there will be bonuses, and there will be incentives, which are often locked in, so shipping incentives and stuff. So if the Metacritic score and things, and people are always like, oh, how possibly can a bonus be tied to a Metacritic score? And it's like, look, at the end of the day, when a contract is signed, we need some legality, some like enforceable ways to say company A is going to give company B a shit ton of money, or like there's going to be some trade, and you need something that's measurable in court. And turns out quality is a hard thing to measure. One of the best things they came up with was, is your Metacritic score in this bucket or is it in this bucket? And there have been instances where a company has missed a Metacritic bonus by like 1 point, and the other company's gone, you know what, here's the bonus anyway, you were so close. So it's not all bad. But yeah, I think it'll take a few years for the cyberpunk crunch stories to truly come out. But that was one of the reasons when I did the comic book, I kept everything anonymous, because, there are stories in there from CD Projekt Red. There are some CD Projekt Red stories in there. And the thing is, the stories about cyberpunk were happening on Witcher. They weren't happening as bad, because it turns out a lot of the core staff has since left since Witcher. And good news, the Polish game scene has exploded into a lot of smaller studios now. So, yay for Poland. It happens. It happened in Guildford. Guildford came out of this large studios shedding through crunch and churn, and basically people getting experienced and more comfortable. And they're like, I don't want to move. We'll just do our thing here. So yeah, that happens. But that's there. Is all crunch bad? As I said, I don't think that our goal should be to eliminate crunch entirely, because, as I say, there will always be that one weekend that needs to happen, that one milestone. The difference is, when it does happen, is the company willing to talk about it? Are they willing to compensate you for it? And is it unusual? And are they reasonable, right? If someone, has plans, if someone has tickets booked to a thing, or someone has a thing, do they say, go do that thing, come back? Or do they go like, can you cancel it? And I think one of the bigger problems also with crunch is that it tends to apply unevenly across teams. People have this mindset of the doors are locked and no one can go home kind of thing. QA, worst department for crunch. And the problem is with QA is because so many people come into QA and are seen as low-skilled labor. I would strongly disagree with the label low-skilled labor, but they're seen as low-skilled labor. They tend to be the lowest paid, but they also tend to have the highest churn. And you have a lot of people who enter the industry in QA and burn out after a few years. And studios incorrectly because, oh my God, a good QA person, good embedded QA person, freaking gold dust, but incorrectly treat QA as an expendable resource. So, and also QA tends to be heavily involved at the tail end of a product. And if you've got, so a classic example with like ultimate shitty scenario for a QA person is you have a very senior staff member working on a thing. Maybe they're a bit older, maybe they're a bit jaded, maybe they've done crunch enough times that they don't give a shit, but maybe they're just arrogant, maybe they're foolish, maybe they're sloppy. But they push back on a bug, or they say, I can't repo this, no, it's not fine. And like that weight, it's very easy to shove it onto QA. So QA has the worst experience of crunch of any department. I think I can comfortably say that. I don't think there's any controversialness in that statement. Though I'd say a close second is programmers. Not too close, but programmers, because programming is such a elastic job. It's an elastic job. It's hard to do. So that's the thing. We've got to stop thinking of the one-off weekend or the long nighter as something different from crunch. It's crunch. It's just crunch in small bursts. And that's why I say you've got to acknowledge the different. Explicit crunch, where it's externally enforced, is very easy to spot. Implicit crunch, where it is brought about through emotional factors, through imposter syndrome, through work peer pressure, through blitz spirit, all that kind of stuff, that is still crunch. That is 100% still crunch. The difference is that how regular is it? You've got to be careful of ever saying, "No, that's not crunch," and then because basically if you treat it as crunch and you measure it as crunch, you can go, okay, it's a bit of steam coming off the engine, the creative engine that's powering our studio, and we can measure that bit of steam, and it's okay if the bit of steam sort of wobbles up and down because it's creative work. It happens, but it's something you keep an eye on. Something you keep an eye on. And if one of your employees is staying a little bit late all the time, maybe they're not communicating enough. Maybe they're not saying no enough. Maybe they are struggling. Maybe they need more mentorship. There's a range of issues there, but you have to track it. You have to track it. And the thing is crunch, even that long overnighter is harmful. It should be tracked as such. And it's good to think about it as a drug, because people forget coffee is a drug. We just don't have huge amounts of it. It is bad. It's like, even if you're just shoving sugar in your body, like even if you're just having a lot of like overnight takeaway food at work or whatever, and you're eating poorly, that is, damaging your long-term health. So you do need to track it. 100% need to track it. And, that's good. I've crunched and I loved it, and I wouldn't change it. That didn't make it good, but nobody was exploiting me. So this is it. Is crunch can be addictive. And I, as I said, that first project I worked on, if you had asked me at the time, I was top of the world. It was great. I paid the price, but I paid the price a year later. It takes a toll on your body. But this is why I say we need to recognize the implied crunch, and we need to acknowledge that it's still crunch. And as I said earlier, it is different if you have equity. It is different and the thing is, sometimes that crunch drives your career forward, right? And it's a tough question. But if your career is built on crunch, like if you've got these amazing achievements on your CV, but you achieved them by damaging your long-term health, by working at a pace that's unsustainable, then in the next job, if you can't maintain that crunch and you start your CV, like your experience, like, it is a cycle. It is a cycle, and it's tough. Yeah, and a good boss will protect you from implicit crunch. It is, as I say, it is possible to protect your staff, and long term, we know for most companies, it is the right decision to protect your staff from long-term crunch. And now I'm going to say something controversial. It is better to fire people than to put them in crunch. That's going to come across harsh, but I think a lot of times people think saying no and terminating contracts and letting people go is the worst thing in the world. And sometimes crunchers use it as an excuse not to pay people. Or let me rephrase that. Sometimes a small company especially is in a bad situation, usually because a game fell through, a contract fell through, things happen. It's the industry. You're worried about your next 3 months payroll. You think, as a studio, if this project milestone gets hit, everything will be great. You are open and honest with your staff and say, hey guys, we're in a bad spot. We need to hit this milestone. I'm taking a pay cut as your boss because I want everything to go through, and we're going to push and we're going to hit this milestone. And maybe sometimes that's the right decision. But the thing that people won't tell you, and the thing that's often a better and a healthier decision for all parties involved, is to fail, is to turn around and go, we can't make the next 3 months payroll. Okay, these people need to be let go, not because they're bad staff members, but because we cannot afford to pay them. And if we were to keep them on for these 3 months and we were to resolve the situation, at the end of the 3 months, the emotional toll that these people would have taken on, the physical toll that these people would have taken on, is going to be large. And it's not like hitting this milestone is all of a sudden going to make us millionaires. We are going to just be in a situation to keep doing what we're doing. And so sometimes it is better to fire staff, and sometimes it is better to say no. And it might sting a little when it happens, but it's healthier. And sometimes a staff member may not be cutting it. As I said, like with mentorship and stuff, sometimes the solution is you assign them a mentor, you help them, you work with their producer, and you go, okay, how do you meet the goals, and da-da-da-da-da. But it might be the situation that they are just in over their head, or they don't mesh, or something's going wrong. And it is better to let them go. It is better to let them go, because you could always hire them again in the future. This is the thing. I think Hollywood has a much better approach. There's issues with it. But a project mindset is very useful to get into. It's not right for everyone, but it's okay to walk away from a company and come back in the future. It's okay to have worked with someone cool in this thing and say, hey, actually for the next thing, you're not the right person to work with. That's fine. Maybe the next project after that will be the right project for us to work again on. But yeah, I think so often crunch is seen as the compassionate solution, or like the team spirit solution. And there's a very interesting metric that when people hear, they get very upset about. And it is, so there's a bunch of social metrics we track societies on. Different economists and welfare people have different scales. I'm blanking on this name of this metric, but there's like 5 key factors that this metric used, and one of those factors is family cohesiveness. Like, how important is the family structure in a particular society or country? How solid is the family unit? And that is a very good, healthy factor for society in a bunch of ways, but it does have negatives. And one of the negatives is countries that trend high on that chart tend to have much higher abuse metrics and lower social mobility. And so that, when you apply that to the games industry, that's what happens. When you get companies that have this very tight family attitude, or we're all in it together attitude, not always a bad thing, but it is the fertile soil for some very bad crunch practices to grow out of if you're not careful of it. It's not to say you don't want that attitude in a studio. It's not to say it's not healthy. I'm just saying it's a rose garden, and if you know anything about rose gardens, roses smell very sweet and very strong, and it is very easy to miss the smell of decay in a rose garden if you're a gardener. So that's the thing, is that we're all in it together. That small team scrappy attitude can be the rose garden that hides the smell of stench crunch. There we go. As an industry, we're still not at the point where we can adopt the project mindset across the board. It's getting close to that model, and to some degree, I do think it's inevitable. There's obviously some teams that don't scale to it. Middleware and tech teams are a good example. One of my favorite, can I mention them? Yeah, I can mention them. I'm not a huge fan of Ubisoft games myself personally, but one of the things I like about Ubisoft is they've got a very good middleware department, and one of their middleware teams is an AI team that they do R&D research on AI things. And the thing is, the first game it tends to ship in, like the first Ubisoft game it tends to ship in, it's like a tiny little feature in a corner somewhere, not critical to anything. And then like 5 games down the line, it's like a core thing, and they build it over time. You could never do that kind of work with a project mindset. So that's a good example of something that won't shift to a project mindset. But I think largely speaking, I hope the games industry shifts to a project mindset. And then you can look at the balance sheet, not only of how much you paid for the project, but how many hours you put into the project. Something I started. This is what I really wanted to get to. 2020, okay, because we're coming towards the end of time. 2020 has been uniquely challenging for crunch for companies. People feel lower productivity because they're working from home for the first time. It happens. People are out of sight. So remember how I said good seniors will spot it, and your bosses will spot it, and your team might spot when you're working longer hours. It is much harder to spot when everyone's working from home. But then the other thing is there's lost efficiencies because, it is hard to go remote work. And I have heard a lot of stories this year from a lot of different people about how many hours they've been working. Myself personally, I think I worked more hours in 2020 than the last. I don't think I have worked as many hours as I have this year since before I joined Sony. Okay, I don't. Can I? No, I can't name the company. Damn. There's a lot of contracts and lawsuits and stuff that happens in the world, but let's just say it's been a long time since I've worked this many hours. And it didn't creep up on me until August, when I realized how many hours I'd worked. And I'm actually at the point now where I am installing time tracking software on all my devices and my computer and everything, purely because I didn't consciously realize how far my hours had upticked. Yeah. There's a lot of reasons for that, and it's very difficult for me to talk about because it's obviously very recent. It's work, it's NDAs, it's blah, 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 blah. Obviously Dreams launched in February. We had the pandemic. So we launched right as the pandemic was hitting us. And then, PlayStation 5 is a thing. So, there's a lot of unique situations there, but I have not worked more. I have worked more hours this year than I have worked since a long time. Yeah. And speaking to other game developers, I am hearing the same story. The amount of hours that most of them are putting in are significantly higher this year. Across the board, I've heard that. I've not heard anyone go, oh, I'm working less. I've heard some people say, oh, I have more hours in the day because I'm not doing my commute anymore, because some people have a very long commute. But I think because most people, the transition to working from home was not self-initiated and was not thought about, was not planned. It was very much a mad rush for a lot of people to sort of adapt to the new working from home situation. And a lot of people didn't have time to set up a home office, or didn't have space to set up a home office. For the first few months of this year, I was still working in the lounge in our old flat before we bought this one. And that was tough because I was working within 2 meters of my wife, which is just not a great thing. We'll do a whole nother stream about how it's been working from home from 2020. That is a talk I want to get into. But the short answer for what we're talking about today, for crunch, there has been more implicit crunch this year across the board from game devs I've spoken to than any other year. So that's been interesting. So yeah, explicit crunch, where your boss asks you to work on the weekend or whatever. Quack, suck a duck, we all recognize it's a duck. Implicit crunch, where for emotional reasons you may have stretched yourself, you may push yourself, maybe you want to prove a point, maybe just say that is still crunch. That is crunch, needs to be recognized as crunch. Not all crunch is bad. Well, let me rephrase that. All crunch is bad. Every single bit of crunch, even a little bit of passionate extra hour there, but it is acceptable to have a small amount of crunch. It is the steam that comes off the creative engine. It just needs to be tracked, and you need to keep an eye on it, that things aren't building up to a boiling point, and it won't evenly be distributed across the team. One department may take the brunt of the load. You may find one or two staff members are taking the brunt of the load. I have heard of teams where the bulk of the team has never crunched, and then one or two of the people on the team have crunched to ridiculous levels. And if you're what's that old phrase? Young, dumb, and full of cum. Somewhat sexist, but it's such a good rhyming couplet, or not couplet, rhyming triplet. You may think that crunch won't hit you. It will. But one of the advantages you have when you're young and new to the industry and you don't have experience to bank on is the ability to reach into that youthful reserve of energy. So that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it will not always be there for you. And careful of use of stimulants and stuff. And there was a time in my life where I was like drinking like 10, 14 cups of coffee a day. Now I'm down to like 2. So there's that. And, Adderall. Please, unless your doctor subscribes it, never take Adderall. And worse, if your office has a culture of sharing Adderall, leave. So that might come shocking to some people who've not heard that. I'm hearing it happen in some studios, specifically some small indie studios, where they are sharing Adderall or sharing amphetamines. Leave. We got rid of that in the early sort of 2000s, because it used to be that drugs were more of a thing in office culture, specifically the games industry. When I speak to some of my older friends in the games industry, it used to be a more thing. Cocaine used to be a bigger thing. We mostly got that out of the games industry. Adderall's making a return as the new stimulants and amphetamines, specifically among younger programmers. I'm hearing about it. So leave. If anyone has Adderall in a drawer that is shared about, run for the fucking hills. It's not worth it. Anyway, yes, it does, and we need to have a separate chat about that sometime. We will talk about working from home in 2020 and what's 2020 been like working from home. But that being said, I do have a job to get to, and we try to keep this semi-regular. Thanks for those of you who dropped by. We always do these chats. They're often fun chats. They're often chats about weird things. It's just our morning stream. But sometimes we'll occasionally do a serious little chat like this. As I say, I've been talking a lot about VR lately, talking a lot about VTubing lately. I'm I have been fascinated by CodeMiko lately. I really want to do a chat about CodeMiko soon. But yeah, good stuff happening. And it's good to see you all, and take care of yourselves. And I will see you tomorrow. So, bye-bye.
Rock it like you so.